Chief Operating Officer here at Hudson. Let me welcome you to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center on behalf of Hudson Institute, Ken Weinstein, our President and CEO, and on behalf of the Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal, led by Bill Shambra. We're glad you all could be here. We're honored to have as today's guest Governor Mitch Daniels. Of course, no stranger to Hudson. He led us in the past and still went on to be an enormously important national leader and, of course, not only governor, but creative policymaker for our nation. We're very honored to have him back here. About a year ago that he was in Washington, we were given the opportunity to honor him. He tells the story of how he was punished for telling the truth during that in this book, so I'll let him follow up. We have a biography, a complete biography, or more or less complete biography of all of our speakers. Let me just mention them briefly and then allow you to do justice to their backgrounds with the material at your chairs. In addition to Governor Daniels, who has served in many positions and been in many positions of leadership, and been, of course, talked about for even more positions of leadership, we're joined by David Brooks, who is, of course, New York Times columnist and senior editor of the Weekly Standard, among other things, and Bill Galston, who holds the Ezra Zilka, chair at the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he's also a senior fellow. I won't say more about them, and I won't take their time with my introduction. We're here to discuss Governor Daniels' new book. It's available in the back and available for purchase. Let me just mention one thing from his book before you run back there, because he says, if America is subsiding or plummeting into a position of parity or secondary world importance is acceptable to you, then see the cashier for a refund of this book. So if you're a sniveling loser, this book is not for you, and the author is warning you that. I do think it's important to talk, to let him talk about the lessons that he's bringing forward, but I think it's also important to give you a little bit of a flavor of what he does here. I'll just mention a couple sentences. First of all, he mentions the genre of such books and says, as far as I can tell, I haven't cheated myself much by skipping the last couple of thousand titles by senators, presidents, and former thises and that's. In other words, he doesn't read books by people who've been in office before because they don't have much to say. He gives you a context of the generation that brought all of us, I think, into this land at this time, and he says, I dislike the self-absorption that has characterized my generation. We baby boomers have confused our numbers with importance. And in addition, he talks about the larger state of majorities and says, large majorities of Americans are clueless or even badly mistaken about their own history and the history of past fallen empires, encouraged on every side to think of themselves as victims of an unfair system and their country as nothing special. They can quite logically react to economic adversity, not with bootstraps resolve, but with self-pity and a search for villains. I guess the appeal to larger majorities is not a mystery anymore. He's someone who has not only led, but in the course of that leading, confronted us with the real problems, the problems that other people hide, the problems of economic danger, which is critical as he presents in this book in some detail, but also an example of how to confront these. He starts with how bad it really is, and says things that, I guess in the old Soviet Union would be called deviationism. But his courage and his good humor in saying them makes them an opportunity to teach. It's something that used to be called statesmanship and still is the highest form of citizenship, and as far as I think our country needs it, and as does the world. So without any further ado, join me in welcoming our friend Governor Mitch Daniels.
Always fun to be back home here at Hudson, although my affinity for the place has led me to violate a basic rule of public presentations and the life I'm in, which is never get yourself cornered into interrogation by a panel smarter and more knowledgeable than you are. And, look at this murderer's row here. Plainly, the course of prudence for me would be to filibuster until the end of the hour, but that would cheat all of you. I've admired each of these fellas for a long, long time, and you do too. They're probably the reason that you're here. So thanks, one and all, for this chance to come and practice my current profession, which is shameless hucksterism on behalf of this thing I've written. Let me try to summarize for you what was and wasn't on my mind in presuming to write something like this. And let me tell you why this particular venue, this hour we'll spend together, is especially gratifying to me, because the topic of citizenship and the proper role of a citizen in a free society was very much on my mind in writing this book in the first place, and almost no one else paying much attention to it, and I understand why. Let me tell you what, in my conception, this book is not, by way of defining what to me it is. It's not autobiographical. It's not a book by a candidate. When I first started writing, when I first outlined this thing almost 2 years ago now, I was very proud of the opening. I mean, I'm a rookie at this. Brooks and Galston, these guys have been writing forever, but someone said, what you do is you write up an outline, and we'll see if somebody's interested in it. So the first sentence of the book, what I intended to be the first sentence of the book was, so many books are written because the author intends to run for President of the United States. This one's written specifically because I don't. But I'm concerned about the country, and I want to tell you why. I thought that's catchy. That's a grabber. Of course, they made me jettison it. That's the only. But it never had any such intent, and I don't think you'll find it exactly like many other such efforts. The world did not need another purple polemic, and I tried to avoid that. The world did not need another tome about the economic and cultural disaster that excessive debt wreaks on the societies that allow it to accumulate. So I treated with that, but I don't pretend to be as expert as others who've already laid all this case out. It doesn't pretend to be a philosophical history, because I'm not equipped to write one, but I insisted on a short chapter at the beginning just to remind those who know and to suggest to those who maybe weren't taught that this whole idea of government by consent of the governed is not only a fragile thing, that's where the title comes from. Everybody in this room remembers Ben Franklin's comment at the very dawn of liberty in this country that suggested that he and the other founders were acutely aware that what they were doing might not last. And but they were hardly the first, and so there's a long, long lineage. I say I don't know when the first Greek coined the term, but within a week somebody said, well, that'll never work. And with some reason. So this is by way of saying that this particular conversation we're about to have, I expect to enjoy and probably learn from, because at least in part I hope we'll spend a little time on the question of what kind of people will we be. If this effort adds any value at all, it is an attempt anyway to suggest that this moment in our history, this, as I see it, survival level threat we are facing, from the debts we've accumulated and are scheduled to add to, is, if anything can be, is even bigger than a threat to our standard of living. It is even bigger than a threat to the American ideal, which should all concern us all at least as much as GDP levels and median income levels and all of that. For the richest society human imagination could ever have conceived of already, even in stalled condition. But you can see fraying around the edges that eternal American optimism that has always driven us forward. At whatever level of our economic development, Americans have always believed that tomorrow would be better than today, their children would live better than they did, and that I can make of myself whatever I'm able and hardworking enough to do. Beyond those two dangers, I believe, is the danger that we will become the latest casualty of the spotty history of self-governance. It's our ability to govern ourselves that's on trial. And I think both sides of our national debate tend to sell the American people very short. On the one hand, there is the well-established school of thought personified by our current president and all the people around him that out of enormous benevolence, I'm sure, I refer to this group loosely as our benevolent betters, believe that life's just become too complicated for those poor, benighted fellow citizens of ours. And they're victims in a sea of predators. And that really cannot be expected to pick the right mortgage or credit card, the right place for their kid to go to school, let alone their own health care. So complicated. Probably not their own light bulbs. On the other side are people who would instinctively rebel at all those notions, but still, from time to time, I think, fall prey to a similar inadequate regard for our fellow citizens, and who point out correctly that more and more are dependent on their fellow taxpayers. We say government, but that's not literally true. Fewer and fewer are paying, at least visibly and noticeably, for the government we've piled up for ourselves, and that various cultural, incredibly important cultural norms and practices are eroding. And that's all true. But the contention of the book is that we ought to assume the very best about our fellow citizens. We ought to address them as freeborn citizens who are capable of listening to facts they have not been told, who are capable of coming to not only leading their own lives as, I say, creatures of dignity, not objects of therapy, and of coming together in a body politic to place the future before the present, their children's interest ahead of their own, to make the quite sensible and relatively less painful decisions we have to make. I talk a lot about the work that I think about the subject that the Bradley Center rather uniquely, I think, concentrates on. There's a chapter called The Great Inversion. And like a lot of the book, since most of it was written a year ago, much of this has become much better understood since. But the point I'm making is that there's been a huge upside down effect in which an ethic of public service that some of us learned, which was that the important parts of life are the private realms, enterprise and nonprofit organizations and voluntary associations, free practice of faith, and so forth. That this is where life in a free society really resides, and that government is that set of activities that people of goodwill do as they are able, in order to support, protect, and promote the flourishing of the important realms. Now, not everyone sees it that way, and obviously there is a very large and maybe growing school of thought that says no. The most important decisions have got to be made collectively and top down. And the private sector's main role is to provide the wherewithal for all that to happen. So that's a conversation we ought to have in this country. Who's in charge here? Along with the question I might loosely put as, what kind of people will we choose to be? That, I think, is reasonably close to the work that's done here at the center, and why this particular conversation, among all those I'm having about this little epistle of mine, is one I've looked forward to. This book, someone said, well, what's the tone of the book? I said, I think it's a reasonable balance between obstinate optimism and total panic. I don't believe in panicking, and I don't think you'll come away, if you should read it, with that sense. But I do believe that action cannot come soon enough, cannot be too bold, and that pursuant to that is really important over the next 14 months, that we engage with these subjects, all of us, in just simply in being responsible citizens, that we urgently need a change of national policy, and therefore a change of national leadership. That I can wish in my imagination that our current president, or a president of his party, had chosen to grasp this nettle, or these various nettles that we're facing. They'd be in so much better position to do it. But that's not going to happen. And so in some part, this book is addresses itself to folks who see the world more or less as I do, and suggests it won't be enough to win the next election. It won't be enough to be the default option, which, for all I know, may be enough to win. Next year ought to be a year to assume the best about the American people, to try to summon it forth, to try to level with the American people, and trust that they are able both to understand and to handle and to make reasonable conclusions based on the truths that they deserve to be told. The real goal of the next 14 months ought to be to unify as many people as possible around a program of big change. That's major changes in the safety net programs, at least starting out in time, total commitment to growth. If you believe, as the Bradley Center does, as I do, that the private realms is where, or the whole reason that we have government, that we have government based on self-governance, then you would also agree that the best way out of our current dilemma is rapid resurrection of growth in the private sector, as hard as that's going to prove to be. I believe, and at least I choose to believe, that these things are possible. It's been well written that democracy is and always was a leap of faith. But great enterprises have faith at their center always. And I, for one, see the stretch ahead of us starting, but only starting, with a new national decision next year as a huge opportunity, not only to fortify the American promise, arrest the economic slide that we've been on, but beyond that, to validate the whole idea of government of and by the people for the history that's to be written the rest of this century. So thank you for the chance to come here and brutally summarize these thoughts, and now I look forward to the important part of the program. Thank you. Want me to sit down?
Yeah, I think David's coming.
Thank you. I see a lot of old friends in the audience. Many people I haven't seen in a little while. I know you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourselves speak. So I'll try to get out of the way. In 2006, I ran a column called Run, Barack, Run, telling Barack Obama he should run for president. This column had a tremendous influence on the American public, and they elected him. Earlier this year, I think, I wrote a column called Run, Mitch, Run, usually when I write this column, it's pretty much a settled deal, how the election goes. Many people may not know how the columns are actually handed to the candidate, telling them to run. It's, if any of you have seen an Annunciation painting, I dress up as an angel. I flew out to Indianapolis. I interrupt Mitch while he's reading a book, maybe Road to Serfdom, something like that. And I tell him to run. He decided not to, much to the worst for the Republican Party and the Republic, I think. He had 3 reasons for not running. 1, he's a normal person. 2, he thought the White House would be an architectural downgrade from the state capitol in Indianapolis, which is true. And 3rd, he told me this was the year the Colts were going to be a juggernaut. Didn't want to miss their Super Bowl run. And if anybody watched TV last night, they know that too is going just great. I think I think the world of Governor Daniels. I keep a list of 5 public figures who I really admire just to cheer myself up in dark times. People like Eliot Spitzer. No, I'm just kidding. But people like heroes of mine, George Shultz is one. Certainly Governor Daniels would be on that list, somebody for whom service is about the job and not about themselves. Nonetheless, and I think the book gives you a sense, an inside view of how government should really be. Takes a lot of sort of high-profile issues, the selling off of a road in Indiana, other things, and really shows why they're just sensible. And I think you get the spirit not of a conservatism that is abstract, but a conservatism that is concrete and context-driven and really pragmatic. So I thought the book reflected the man perfectly well. Nonetheless, I'll try to pick a fight on 2 big subjects. The first is philosophical on the subject of our betters. The Democrats, he says, have a faith that the public needs protection and they're there to do that. There's a lot of truth to that. I would say the Obama administration has a great faith in the ability of intelligent experts to organize the world. The IPAB thing for the healthcare reform, there's a general sense that if you get the smartest people in the room together, they will be able to create a solution, organize a plan, and plan society. And so I very much take Governor Daniels' critique of that to heart. Conservatism is based on the idea of epistemological modesty, that we can't know much about the world, and therefore we should devolve solutions to the lowest possible level. The only thing I'd say to add on to that, and maybe is in tension with it, is the people are no great shakes either. It is nonetheless true, and I think Governor Daniels, like most elected officials who have won election, is too generous toward where the people are. It is true that countries rise and fall based on the moral stature of the country. And that moral stature can rise and fall depending on circumstances. And sometimes it's up to government and a leadership class to lead it in one direction or another, to serve as the education of the country. Now, big government occurred in part because a lot of Democrats in this town and a lot of Republicans in this town wanted it. It also occurred because the American people wanted it. It also occurred for a lot of bottom-up reasons, and it has become very hard to cut, not so much because people in this town and even Barack Obama doesn't want to cut it, but because they don't see a political solution. The elemental fact is that the Americans want more government than they're willing to pay for, and if you tell them you're going to cut their Medicare, they will punish you. If you tell them they will cut any benefits, they will punish you. If you tell them we're going to have to make some shared sacrifices, they say, I don't believe you, you're just going to screw me. Now, they may have some basis for that, but nonetheless, there is along with some of the moral ebbs and flows of the culture, there is an idea that they can get all the benefits without paying for it. And so we should be a little suspicious of simply deferring to the people, and we should acknowledge that there's a role for a leadership class and for government and for public action to educate and organize the country. And that's what the founders believed, and they believed in what Irving Kristol called Republican virtue. This is not a democracy. It's a republic, and they did it because they didn't trust them. The founders didn't trust themselves, and they didn't trust the people, and they thought it was important to erect institutions between the people and the government. And so that Republican check on the populace was very part of our founding and part of good government. So that's a more philosophical critique, a little suspicion of the people, even the people of Indiana. The second, more practical one is that I think the governor's view of what government should do is necessary but insufficient. To me, there are 3 big challenges in front of us. One, to create fiscal sustainable future, and I give the governor's book an A on that. B, to create a growth agenda so the country grows, and I give Governor something between a B and an incomplete on that. The third challenge is the need for social cohesion, widening inequality, wage stagnation. I give the governor an incomplete on that subject. And I think it is those underlying structural problems with the economy that the governor, like most of the Republican Party, has not been articulate about. It wouldn't be enough to simply reduce the size of government, reduce taxes in order to get the country humming again the way it was decades ago. There are a series of problems that have nothing to do with government and will not be solved by getting government out of the way. Some of those are problems with human capital. The economy just requires much more technical expertise, and you've got to have higher levels of human capital, and we have been stagnant on that front. I would say the government even has a role in enhancing human capital, especially through early childhood education. The second set of problems have to do with structural problems plaguing the labor markets and plaguing the economy as a whole, which again have nothing to do with government. I buy into Tyler Cowen's thesis that there's been a stagnation of technological innovation. There are certainly fewer business startups than there were decades ago. We've had decades of dismal job creation even before the current recession. We've had decades, according to Michael Spence, where the only jobs that have been created have been in sectors where we don't trade or where we don't compete with the Japanese or the Chinese. And so these are all deep structural problems not caused by government, but caused by technological change, globalization, and other things. So I think what we need to do is move things from consumption toward production, maybe reduce entitlement spending and increase investments in technological innovation, and that's a role for government. And the third big structural change the Republicans are mute about in general is essentially the social fabric. We've had widening inequality, not only economic inequality, but social inequality. College graduates have half the divorce rates of high school graduates. Illegitimacy rates are skyrocketing, not only among African Americans, but among the white working class. Rise in single parenthood, rise in drug addiction at the lower levels, rise of alcoholism. People without a college degree just lived in very disorganized worlds. And I think there's a role for government in fixing that. And then the final point I'll make has to do with the current situation we're in. I happen to be a relative pessimist about where we are. I think there's a realistic chance of a double-dip recession and a 10 years of a lost decade. And what created this mess? Well, there were a million different causes of this mess. There was a buildup of debt. Since then, there's been a lack of consumer demand. There's been a lack of business investment. There's been a lack of a floor for the housing market. There's been uncertainty caused by regulation. There's been uncertainty caused by people not trusting the Obama administration, not trusting each other. There have been multivariate causes to the situation we're now in, which could lead to a decade of stagnation. My problem is that each party takes their favorite cause and pretends that's the only cause. So for example, the Democratic Party really wants to spend money. They believe in using government spending. So they pick the one cause, lack of consumer demand, that can be addressed by more government spending. And they do a stimulus package to build up consumer demand, and if it doesn't work, well, we should do another one, we should do a bigger one. That's the one thing they focus on. The Republican Party loves to cut taxes and reduce regulation. So they say the one cause of this financial crisis is lack of business investment. We've got to lower taxes and reduce regulation, we'll get more investment. And again, just one cause. The problem is there are dozens of causes to the situation we're in, and you have to take a holistic approach. And the lesson of that is don't try to pick out one cause because you're not smart enough. Do a big thing that cuts across partisan lines. I thought the Bowles-Simpson was the beginning of that. Doing some things Republicans like reducing taxes, simplifying taxes. Some things Democrats like, maybe a consumption tax. Again, cutting across a whole series of things that go across the current categories. And I think that's an approach which is more multivariate than the Republican orthodoxy right now, but necessary first to get us out of the current crisis, and then more broadly, the longer economic problems we're going to face for decades. So thanks.
Well, I can't match David's unique brand of stand-up sociology, and I'm not going to try. In the next 15 minutes, you're going to see vividly the distinction between a spectacularly successful columnist and a widely ignored policy wonk. Now, speaking as a lifelong Democrat, I say in all sincerity that I deeply regret, although completely understand, Governor Daniels' decision not to run for president. I have 3 reasons for this. First of all, we desperately need an informed debate on the fiscal and economic crisis we confront, and I think we would have been more likely to get one with your voice in the mix. Secondly, I am risk averse about my country. As a citizen, I'd like the government to be in competent hands, whoever wins the next election. And third, and if I may speak personally, I've always wanted a president I could look straight in the eye without getting a crick in my neck. Now, since this town has been a little bit short of agreement across party lines recently, let me begin by ticking off an incomplete list of elements of this book that I found very agreeable. The focus on vigorous economic growth, amen. The injunction to be guided in our discussions by the facts. One line in the book, this conclusion is not ideological but mathematical. Words repeated almost verbatim by the President of the United States not too long ago. If we can get on the plane where we are talking about the facts and their implications, I think we'd be better off. The governor's insistence on putting first things first, focusing on what really matters right now, and, as he put it famously, declaring a truce on other differences. Again, amen. The idea of principled safety net reform, more means testing, adjusting age and eligibility requirements, adjustments to indexation formulas, the focus on real insurance as opposed to first dollar coverage for everything. There's room for serious discussion on all of those points. Growth-oriented tax reform. Whatever you want to say about our tax code today, we do not have a pro-growth tax code, and I think everybody knows it. And if we adopt that as our heuristic device for thinking about reform, I think we'd be way ahead of the game. And once again, we could have a serious discussion across party lines. The idea that you tax things you want less of. Again, amen. The governor vigorously defends his decision to increase the cigarette tax in Indiana, and one of his justifications is we want less smoking, and we're going to get less of it if we have a higher tax. Now, by the way, that makes you sound a little bit like a benevolent bettor, I must say, but I wouldn't want to press that point too hard. The suggestion that we should consider qualitatively different revenue sources, such as a VAT or some other form of tax on consumption and production as opposed to income and savings. Very important, and I will do the governor no favor by quoting this passage from his book, his insistence on reasonable revenue levels in light of the debt crisis. And here's the exact quote. I'm an advocate of the lowest taxes consistent with national necessity. The national necessity of our age is to overcome our debt burden before it destroys the America we love. Now listen carefully. This is no time for theological think tank arguments about 18% versus 19% versus 20% of GDP. We can resume those debates after the enemy is thrown back from our gates. I would love to bronze those words and send them around town. They're a real breath of fresh air, and the parties could do business on the basis of that premise and the others that I've already approved of. Here are some others. The call for reasonable regulatory relief. I don't think an outright moratorium, let alone an outright multi-year moratorium, is particularly realistic, but something along the lines of Senator Mark Warner's PAYGO recommendation, I think, is realistic and would be a real discipline on regulatory zeal. I join with you in rejecting what you rightly call the mad pursuit of zero in environmental regulation. I agree with the call for a broad-based energy policy, and as a passionate devotee of sensible infrastructure investment, I absolutely agree on the importance of that with mechanisms that ensure the substantial involvement of private capital. We do not have enough public capital and cannot mobilize enough public capital to make even a modest dent in the $2.5 trillion of deferred infrastructure investment that we've heaped up over the past generation because we've been short 1 full percentage points of GDP year after year after year in investment. That's just a fact. That isn't ideology. That's mathematics and economics and sensible good government that goes all the way back to Hamilton and the Whigs. So far, so good. But, I wouldn't be doing my job, and I think I'd disappoint the people who invited me here, if I simply stopped after 5 minutes on this point of agreement. So let me disagree without, I hope, being excessively disagreeable during my remaining 10 minutes. First of all, like David Brooks, I would give a lower grade to the governor's discussion of the growth imperative than to the discussion of the fiscal crisis. Here are some things that I think we need to think and talk about in order to have a fully rounded discussion of the growth imperative and the challenges to it. In addition to infrastructure, I think there are other very important forms of public investment, such as basic research, that tend to be undersupplied by private market transactions. And there's a lot of economic theory that tells us why. So I think a fuller consideration of the forms of public investment that neoclassical economics itself tells us are necessary. Secondly, one of the distinctive features of our current situation is the debt burden, not only in the public sector, but also in private households, that is constraining the resumption of vigorous consumption and therefore economic growth. I don't think we can get out of this fix without thinking a lot harder about household debt in general and mortgage debt in particular than we have during the past 3 years, and that may require some outside-the-box thinking that the financial sector won't much like, but that's not a reason not to go there. A third growth imperative is to focus a lot more attention on the growing higher education gap between us and our competitors. Our competitors are surging in higher education completion while we've stagnated for the past 3 decades. That's not a viable formula for the future. We need to think about that. And finally, of course, as the headlines in the newspapers remind us on a daily basis, our national economy is not self-enclosed. We have an international, indeed a global financial crisis that we really have to pay attention to. If Europe falls, it doesn't matter how smart we are. We're going to be dragged down too. So, this is not just a gubernatorial or even a national issue. This requires some real international leadership. Now, I want to dedicate the next portion of my remarks to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who famously remarked that every man is entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts. And I have a few factual disagreements with this book that are not trivial. In a book by a very popular and successful governor that I recently read, the following words occurred. This whole setup is enough to give Mr. Ponzi a bad name or a legitimate job. If old Carlo were around today, he'd have made an ideal Social Security commissioner. Now, I'm relieved to see that Governor Daniels doesn't agree with that because he outlines in pages 201 to 203 of his book, for the interested, a very sensible menu of relatively modest fixes to Social Security that would be enough to stabilize it actuarially. Sort of makes me wonder why he wrote those words in the first place, but perhaps he was trying to blaze the way for Governor Perry. Secondly, the fiscal impact of the health care reform bill. Now, let me begin by saying there are all sorts of reasons for a legitimate debate about the president's health care bill. But I'm not convinced that what I'm about to read is one of them. And I quote, "Fraud connotes a knowing attempt to mislead, and the authors of the health care bill had to know that their assertions that Obamacare would reduce deficits and lessen rather than frighteningly worsen the debt crisis were untrue," close quote. Well, the Congressional Budget Office is about as close to a neutral professional assessment as you can get in this town. And here's what they have to say, not about the first decade, and we can have a legitimate argument about that, but about the second decade, 2020 to 2030. CBO expects that the legislation would reduce federal budget deficits over the decade after 2019 relative to those projected under current law, with a total effect during that decade that is in the broad range between 0.25% and 0.5% of GDP. Now, the CBO may be wrong, but I don't think they're fraudulently wrong, and I don't think people who base their conclusions on that analysis are guilty of fraud. A third factual disagreement has to do with the Environmental Protection Agency's regulation of CO2. Here again, let me put the relevant words on the table. Quote, "The Environmental Protection Agency, which should probably be renamed the Employment Prevention Agency, declared with no statutory basis at all," remember those words, no statutory basis at all, "that it had the power to regulate carbon dioxide, which is necessary to life on this planet, as a dangerous pollutant." Well, here's the relevant language of the statute, which the Supreme Court interpreted in favor of the EPA. Again, I quote, "The EPA should, by regulation, prescribe standards applicable to the emission of any air pollution from any class of new motor vehicles, which in the EPA administrator's judgment causes or contributes to air pollution reasonably anticipated to endanger public health or welfare." And the Act goes on to define air pollution to include, quote, "any physical, chemical substance emitted into the ambient air," close quote. I think the real quarrel is with the entire style of legislation that's grown up in recent decades that is so general as to hand enormous interpretive power to a complex battle between federal agencies, interest groups, and the courts. This is a default of democracy, but it is not an abuse. It is not an abuse of power against the words of the statute. So the real quarrel is with the words of the statute. I have a couple of more factual disagreements. Here's one on the federal workforce. Quote, "Today's grossly oversized and overly expensive federal government is a major source of government pain." And the governor continues, "The swollen manning tables of the government agencies should be sharply reduced, with all unfilled jobs canceled immediately. This should be followed by a hiring freeze which should last for years." Now, that may be the right thing to do, but I don't think that's the right reason to do it. And here's a little history. Today's federal civilian workforce, let's forget about the military downsizing, today's federal civilian workforce is the same size today, has the same body count that it did 45 years ago. And by the way, it's 10% smaller than it was at the end of Ronald Reagan's 2 terms. And speaking as a former Clintonian, I can tell you why. Because Bill Clinton inherited a civilian workforce of 3 million and left office with a civilian workforce of 2.6 million. It expanded by 2% during George W. Bush's administration and has expanded by another 2.5% since Barack Obama took office. So, a bloated federal workforce, I'm not sure what the basis for that is. And finally, on a constitutional note, the governor says at one point that a government by the people must of necessity be limited in scope, having no power that is not expressly enumerated. Regrettably, by that standard, we don't have a government by the people today, because I would cite not only the necessary and proper clause, But the very instructive debate that surrounded the ratification of James Madison's draft of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, where it was moved from the floor in the House of Representatives that the 10th Amendment be strengthened by inserting the word expressly into the language. And after extended debate, that resolution, that amendment was voted down by a vote of 32 to 17. And it was well understood on all sides what the difference between enumeration and express enumeration is. We have a government of enumerated powers, but not entirely expressly enumerated. And that is a distinction with a difference. I close on a philosophical note. And that is that although I don't think Governor Daniels is entirely of one mind on this point, at various points in the book, he employs the standard trope, standard in some circles, of freedom versus government. So he speaks at one point about pro-freedom policies versus pro-government policies, and he tells a wonderful story about visiting a high school classroom. And, he asks students to give him $1, and I think it was a young man called Brandon who handed him $1, and, governor pocketed it, and the class looked at him sort of quizzically, and he then seized the opportunity to give him a civics lecture, that student was now $1 less free, than he was before he forked over the $1 to the governor. Well, it may sound, it's not trivial to say that I don't agree with that proposition. That student had $1 less in his pocket than he did before he gave it to the governor. Was he $1 less free? Doesn't that depend on what the dollar was used for? There are some forms of taxation and government activity that do not retard or repress freedom, but they enable it and enhance it. And if we don't agree with that, we should all go join the anarchist society. Thank you very much.
I think it's only fair to let Governor Daniels respond.
Well, I have to plead guilty on many counts, and I don't want to go down the list of those things. I want to just mention a couple. I'll mention a couple of those, but there are a couple of the things that were said really have been troubling me too, and I appreciate David and Bill for bringing them up. Just to, by the way, Bill's comments remind me of the. Oh, is this not working?
I think you have to be a little closer.
Bill's comments remind me of the rule someone taught me, that in any sentence, including the word "but," nothing matters except what comes after the comma.
That's right.
Yeah, right. So, but thanks for the generous comments. The part before the comma was pretty good. A lot of things I actually agree. Yes, I wasn't trying to. I don't know what I did say or what you thought I said. I wasn't trying to produce a manifesto here that had absolutely every idea I think might, for instance, contribute to growth. I cut out a lot of things. I was trying, in fact, to make us not only to leave that to other people, but to indicate that I don't pretend to have every answer or necessarily the best answers. But I think I must have not said that clearly enough. But sure, I mean, R&D is a really good example of something that ought to be more heavily invested in, basic R&D at least. Quickly on some of the factual aspects, Bill, the Ponzi thing is interesting. After they pulled everybody in Washington off the pile, and to see what was left of Governor Perry, there was some pretty quick journalism done. A lot of people repaired to their Google machines, and I discovered that the problem with mentioning Carlo Ponzi with regard to Social Security is not that it's not true, is that it's so trite. It had been said for 40 or 50 years. People like Paul Samuelson, people across the spectrum have used this as to loosely liken a pay-as-you-go system that masquerades, at least to some people, as something else, that you're investing in yourself. Now, he shouldn't have stopped there. No one should stop there. I tried not to stop there. Go on to, prescription and also to reassurance of people that we're out to save these programs to create something new for the future. But just to make that point, on some of the things that David said, I don't mean for this to be a majoritarian book. If it had been, I'd have titled it something else. I chose to play off Franklin's famous comment advisedly, but I may have been too careless about that. David, as always, I got his finger on something important. He's pessimistic about the character traits, the virtues in the phrase I insist on reviving, or the word I insist on revising. Look, I can't quarrel with that. I think I try to say in the book that the only operating philosophy in business or public life that ever made any sense to me was optimism. The old coach's maxim, if you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right. And I freely acknowledge there's mountains of evidence that we have slipped, that these traits have atrophied and so forth. But I'm suggesting that, and David says, well, look, government has a role to play in trying to somehow reaffirm them. Absolutely. Wish I knew just what the right mechanism was. But I'm just suggesting maybe one of them is to behave as though people are creatures of dignity. To tell them that you trust them to make their own decisions, and you trust them to make smart decisions when we get together to wrestle with the problem. May prove hopelessly naive, but, I guess what I'm saying, a level below the surface, David, is somebody better find out. If those things really are that far gone, then school's out in a variety of ways anyway. So why not start with the possibly a Pollyanna assumption and see if perhaps it doesn't maybe awaken some dormant traits that we all worry have faded out a little bit. I called the last chapter, it's a play on the president's very successful slogan, change you can believe in. It took me a while after he'd been a president for a year or something, before I ever start thinking about that. I thought, that very obviously successful, he won big, but what's it mean? It's meaningless. It's an empty vessel. Probably the marketing magic was in that. Was in that very fact that the listener could invest that phrase with whatever changes, whatever I think changes, that's what he's for. So I suggested, look, we ought to bend that into change that believes in you, and to present a different set of prescriptions and policies to the American people, as often as possible, couched in language that says, these guys don't think you're up to it, but I do. We do. We want you to have the right. We'll make mistakes, of course we will, but it's a better society and you'll be better off long term if government policy affirms your autonomy and your dignity. See what happens. Multivariate causes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bill kind of cleaned up after me a little bit here. I don't forswear different taxes, and I sure don't forswear more revenues. We're going to have a heck of a lot more revenues, and the book says this. The question is, how do you get them? Mm-hmm. Dialing up the rates in the wretched system we have today, is, I think, leave the philosophy aside. It's impractical. Am I the only one that's noticed this? There's some real ironies in the position the president's allies find themselves in. On the one hand, if you believe in a government that is as big and active and expensive as they do, you have the biggest stake of all in a robustly growing private sector. It's the only place the money can come from, yet all their policies lean against it. Here I am saying every national decision, till further notice, ought to be tested against the question, will it make private sector growth more likely or less likely? Mm-hmm. Everything else, we should break every tie. Every close call should go that direction. And yet, from, card check to Boeing to CO2, on and on and on and on, this administration just reflexively heads the other direction. The other one is that unless you're prepared to change the tax system in the way Bill Galston was talking about, somewhere down the trail of Lowell Simpson and many other people, you have a really big stake in income inequality. This is the biggest irony of all. The only way the president gets all this money he wants is if rich people start getting real rich again. I mean, income inequality widens because that's where all the money's coming from. Well, none of us want that. So, last point, biggest one. David, you are completely right. I've said to people very openly, especially in the last couple of months, if I've been writing this book in the last few months and not principally in Q4 last year, I don't know what, I wouldn't have had an answer, but I would certainly have taken cognizance of your points about social cohesion, and the difficulties of globalization. I was being given one of those awards you don't deserve. You get ex officio, in a job like this, I think, about 2 weeks ago. And it was for people whose issues are what we call family issues. And I said to them, in probably a halting way, I said, listen, a lot of us have always basically believed that economic rationality was the trump card. If you just get the market working in the best way, it will drive down prices, it'll bring it'll bring more wealth, and it'll bring the marvels of consumer society within the reach of people of average means, and that's everything else takes care of itself, but it doesn't. And we are getting in this position where large numbers of Americans, men, in the majority of cases, it isn't clear that even a revival of a higher growth rate would necessarily recreate a situation where people can take care of their families on what the market will pay. And I don't have a real answer, but I admit you're onto a big problem. I guess just to finish, that the book is a faltering attempt to say that freedom and its success, and certainly its spread, depends on a growing, vibrant economy and private sector, but that there are bigger things, and there's something beyond that, and it is optimism, and it is self-governance, and it is a stable and hopeful middle class that makes that possible. And I don't pretend to have the last word on that.
With all those issues on the table, why don't we begin by allowing some questions? Let me start by offering the first one and asking you and the other panelists to pick up where you left off, which is, if in addition to economic and fiscal policies, one were going to look at what you do about the social fabric, the character and the culture of the American people, what policies, some of them are discussed in your book, Governor Daniels, but what policies would you start with? I mean, it is peculiar that, as you pointed out, we are wealthier than anyone could imagine. So the issue is, well, we need more resources to be happy and great. But we feel an acute breakdown of not only our own cohesion as a people, but even taking care of our children at different levels in society. And yet that's very difficult for us to talk about. Maybe some turning to that fundamental problem and the pessimism that I think it gives rise to, and the unwillingness to talk. Just a couple of things about how you see that, especially you have been with people that you're leading in the state and in the nation.
You're asking David, aren't you?
Not that easy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just said I think you can start by trying to structure policies that do empower and that do entrust more decision-making to people, tell them you believe in their ability to do it, and they might just surprise you. I give some examples in the book, including from the healthcare context, in which people of very modest means, both our state employees and uninsured low-income people, I think are proving very, very savvy about consumerism in the most complicated area of all, which is healthcare expenditure. So I think there's some reason for optimism there. But it takes you to the top, maybe, of some slippery ski slopes, such as what we term protectionism, that I've never really gone near before. I will say this, I mean, just in energy policy, which I think is a huge upside possibility for the country. We've gotten one bad break after another for a long time, but these breakthroughs, Hudson is the place I learned all those years ago that we always, that the pessimists are always wrong, and even when you can't see it coming from any other direction, technology shows up. I hope David's wrong about its rate slowing down, and I think maybe he is, but if we've gotten a good break, these astonishing breakthroughs in gas and oil extraction, we cannot afford not to take maximum advantage of that. If there are problems, let's solve them along the way or ameliorate them if they happen, but we cannot deny ourselves that. So I believe that one piece of a very, very large puzzle is to pay Americans for the energy that we need. If it takes a little premium on an all-in calculation, it's a good idea. I'll just give you an example. In Indiana, we established a very explicit Buy Indiana policy. You can think of it as state protectionism if you like, but I thought a very good reason. First of all, we drove our state departments, who aren't paying any attention to this, to use their own procurement. We went from 60 to 90% purchased in the state. We don't make a dumb business deal, but we will pay a very small premium, knowing we're going to capture much more of that in the multiplier effect of those dollars and the taxes from them happening in our state. I would apply the same thing nationally. There are a lot of reasons, they're not economic, to stop paying. It's half our balance of payments problem. You can get and think who we're sending the money to and where the money winds up. So, I mean, you know all this, but if you even leave the national security aspects out, there's a big upside opportunity, and it could create those middle-class jobs we can't seem to find in a significant way. So I know it's just one partial example, but it's a large one as those things go.
David?
I'll take a quick stab. First, let's start with on a philosophical note. Let's remember what choice is. When individuals make choices, it's not an autonomous creature weighing pros and cons. Our choices are socially structured by our genes, by our upbringing, by our culture, by our history, by our family, by the institutions around us. I was actually, a week ago, I was at the Indiana University football game. I was tailgating with 20,000 drunk 20-year-olds. And in that framework, the choices they were making were not the same choices they would have made at church the next day. So social structure really matters. And so I do think there are some things government can do to help encourage a positive social structure. I'm tempted, John, to start with the drug policies of the Bush administration. Those were part of creating a social structure, taking away some temptations of people. But I think you can create a menu of policies that will encourage a better social structure. You can start with young, with nurse-family partnerships, so pregnant and new moms have a structure in which they can raise their kids. You can then go to early childhood educations. These KIPP academies create a social structure for young people and then for the parents around them. You can go on to compassionate conservatism, which I am the last believer in. Using some faith-based and other groups. Actually, Hudson is maybe there are a few Japanese soldiers in the foxhole with me. The idea that you can use faith-based and other institutions to thicken social structures and use government policies to do that. I believe in national service. I believe in raising EITC, and in particular to give men more financial resources so they're marriageable, focusing it on men. And you can go down the list. But there are a whole series of menus or of options on the menu to create a social structure in which people lead forward-thinking and long-term thinking lives, which will in the long run preserve, make them make economically better decisions and more long-run decisions, which will make them richer and more marriageable in the long run.
Bill, you want to say a few words?
Well, as speaking as someone who just about got run out of his own party a quarter of a century ago for daring to argue that a stable, intact family might be a pretty good place to raise children, I'm in no position to disagree with anything that I've heard. But I do think that there is an important economic dimension to the social problems that we're talking about. And, we've already heard about one great inversion. Here's another. Back when I was a graduate student, the conventional wisdom was that this overeducated new class was going to be the death of the American family, and it would be the sturdy lower classes with their traditional values that would save marriage and the family. Well, that was then. Now where are we? As David noted, the more education you have, the more likely you are not only to get married, but to stay married. And so the most traditional families, ironically, are now found in the bluest states. Go figure. Now, what that tells me is that the kinds of economic opportunities that lengthen out time horizons and give people the incentives to make sound long-term choices are now associated with higher levels of education than we ever imagined possible or necessary. I don't think it's any accident that the divorce rate is so much lower among college graduates than it is among high school graduates, let alone high school dropouts who tend not to get married at all. And so one answer to the question is, let us focus more attention than we tend to on the fact that our higher education completion rates have stagnated over the past 3 decades, while around the world, particularly among our competitors, they have soared. So that's one thing I would say. Here's a second thing, also in the economic vein. I'm not a trade expert, but it's my understanding that we can encourage exports by rebating a tax like a VAT at the border, if only we had such a tax to rebate the way most of our competitors do. And if you happen to believe that U.S. manufacturing is a really important source of good jobs, not just in the past, but in the present and the future, then being able to encourage our exports in a way that is fully compliant with international law and regulation, and in a way in which all of our trade competitors are already doing, we're trying to fight this trade war with at least one hand tied behind our back, and I don't think that makes any sense at all. And and I also have to say that I took what Governor Daniels said as a not so veiled endorsement of something like a carbon tax. And if you could use a carbon tax in part to buy down the payroll tax, if employers are taxed less for hiring people, won't they tend to hire more people? So there are all sorts of opportunities here that I think we've been very slow to exploit for all sorts of reasons, and neither political party is blameless, but they both have to get their acts together.
Before we give you any more help on what you've signed up to, Governor Daniels, let me ask a couple questions from the audience. Anybody have any questions out there? Yeah, Debbie. Do we have a, yeah, right there.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. Up on the stage today, we have people who've worked in every administration since Reagan all the way through the second Bush, and somebody who's a self-confessed sap for President Obama. And I'm quite confident that if we got all these people together in a room, they could come up with some policy solutions that they could all agree with, and perhaps the American people could agree with. But the problem we seem to have is a lack of political will, or perhaps a political structure. I'd like to hear each of the panelists talk about what realistic political structures we have today that could actually solve some of our problems. The Senate doesn't seem to do it anymore, and bipartisan commissions are overrated, I think.
Governor.
Well, that's why I think next year is an opportunity not to be missed. If there is, if we're going to create the conditions for big change, I think it's the indispensable element would be a national, a broad majority assembled. There's only one place you can do that, really, and that's around a presidential election. And would that be enough? Can't tell you that. The whole 40 votes thing. I mean, but I can't imagine doing it without that. Let me say that. So that's why I'm really hoping for the kind of campaign that presents these choices and hopes to secure a broad, reasonably broad consensus for action, so we can go get started. I am careful analogizing from the miniature stage in which I've been playing, But we made change after change after change after change, and the state was never known for that at all. And big majorities, big changes require big majorities, we have learned, and also that the flywheel, you can get a flywheel effect in which you can make one and move to the next and the next because the first one seemed to work out okay.
I'd just be curious. I'm interested to know why states work and the federal government doesn't. In general, most states I go to, and you talk to the governors, they're actually moving things, and they have a pretty effective governance system. You don't think Indiana's ungovernable. You don't think Utah's ungovernable. You don't particularly think Maryland's ungovernable. We've got a surplus in Maryland. And so I wonder if it's the states are more cohesive. I wonder if it's they're dealing with issues which are patently less ideological. I wonder, one of your favorite books is one of my favorite books, Manker Olson's Rise and Decline of Nations. I wonder if they just have less special interest accoutrements on top of state government versus federal government. And so I'd be curious to know why that is. My only thing about, I'm in favor of bipartisan commissions so long as they're set up and manipulated behind the scenes by elected officials. And if you look at the way the Social Security reform is in '83, that's how they did it. And so I think if I was hoping the Obama, when he set up the Bowles-Simpson Commission, was secretly engineering what it was going to come up with, and then when it came out, he'd say, "Good, let's hop on board this." I think his failure to hop on board Bowles-Simpson when he had a chance to really open up a big tax reform debate was a colossal failure.
That's David using the our betters card to his advantage here, right?
Exactly. I'm always for the betters if they're smart. We got dumb betters. That's our problem.
We need better betters.
Now, there's a campaign slogan.
Fits on a bumper sticker, too.
Second edition, but it won't be.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, you've touched on a real problem. And I can put it this way very simply. In my adult lifetime, the two political parties have steadily polarized. They've become more internally homogeneous, and they've moved farther and farther away from each other, to the point that political scientists now say that the ideological overlap between the two parties in the Congress of the United States has disappeared. In the Senate of the United States, it is literally the case by standard political science measures that the most conservative Democrat is a tick more liberal than the most liberal Republican. So if you define the center as the overlap between the political parties, then that overlap has virtually disappeared among our elected officials at the national level. By that same measure, our two political parties are more divided than they have been at any point since the 1890s. That's not the 1990s, that's the 1890s. So people who think that things are worse than they used to be, they're right, unless you go back a long way in defining used to be. The American people are not nearly as polarized as their political parties at the national level. And by the way, in states that look like the country in their political party formations, like California, are no more governable than the national government is. So the polarization among elected officials is the key to the problem. And what can you do about that? Well, there is no alternative. You have to think harder about changing the ways in which elected officials come to be elected, so that what you get is a body of elected officials who in the aggregate look more like the American people. And I could bore you but it would take more time than I have, with a series of steps that we've taken in the wrong direction over the past 40 years that have led to electoral polarization, which need to be reversed, or at least very least rethought and reformed if there's going to be any hope at all, starting with our primary system, which is close to being the root of the evil in my judgment.
One of my principal jobs is to make sure that we end on time. I know this. I know, but people have other commitments. But I want to thank our panel. I want to remind people that you can get a copy of this book, which also makes the point that we're not as polarized as our national politics, by the man who's probably spent more time doing field research in the homes of Hoosiers as anyone living. So there's real depth to that knowledge. But let me thank not only Governor Daniels, but our panelists for joining us here today.
Thanks, guys. Nice of you. You notice I tried to exhume. I guess it comes up every generation. The net negative income tax. Yes. I'm not really sure what I think about